typically the two teams representing the Super Bowl have a pretty good quarterback. Of course, there are some exceptions. Like, does anybody know who was the quarterback for the AFC champion 1994 San Diego Chargers? If so, comment down below. Or how about when Rex Grossman somehow quarterbacked a team to a Super Bowl? That was weird. Hell, there were a few practically unnoteworthy quarterbacks who even won the big game, like Trent Dilfer and Brad Johnson, who each game managed teams with historic defenses to a Super Bowl win. You could add Jim McMahon to that list, but he's at least noteworthy for his undeniable drip. But yeah, for the most part, if a quarterback starts a Super Bowl, he's probably a pretty damn good one. He doesn't have to be an all-time great, but he's still likely a good one. Now what happens when two all-time great quarterbacks face off in the big game? For my first example, I was going to look at Super Bowl IX, a game that featured two of the three best quarterbacks of the 1970s, the Steelers' Terry Bradshaw and the Vikings' Fran Tarkenton. But this game was a defensive battle, and each quarterback combined for just under 200 passing yards, Bradshaw with a whopping 96 on a mere 14 pass attempts, and Tarkenton with 102. Tarkenton also threw 3 interceptions and posted a disgusting passer rating of 14.2. Cue the Jaguar Gator 9 quote. This game was more notable for being a defensive battle between two legendary defenses in the Steelers' Steel Curtain and the Vikings' Purple People Eaters. A year later, in Super Bowl X, Terry Bradshaw and his Steelers had their first Super Bowl matchup with the Roger Staubach-led Dallas Cowboys. The Steelers won 21-17, and Terry Bradshaw outplayed Roger the Dodger. The Steel Curtain defense disrupted Staubach, sacking him 7 times and forcing 3 interceptions. Bradshaw's passer rating of 122.5 was miles ahead of Staubach's 77.8. But 3 years later, Staubach and Bradshaw would face off again in Super Bowl XIII. This game was a lot different because both quarterbacks were on the top of their game. This was an absolutely star-studded matchup. Aside from the quarterbacks, there were a combined 18 Hall of Fame players on each team. Also, you had 2 legendary coaches in Chuck Noll and Tom Landry. It was just a legendary game. So yeah, this game had a lot of hype, and it lived up to it. This one was a classic, and is still considered to be one of the greatest Super Bowls of all time. It was just a classic old school game of football, a lot of big plays, a lot of fumbles, and a great aerial showing between these 2 Hall of Fame quarterbacks. Terry Bradshaw threw for 318 yards and 4 touchdowns, and Roger Staubach posted 228 yards and 3 touchdowns. Both quarterbacks completed 17 out of 30 passes. This was the only instance in Super Bowl history where both quarterbacks had the same amount of pass completions and pass attempts. It took me like 20 minutes to verify this fact. It was really tedious, so please like this video. And if you'd like to know, it was very close to happening again when Ben Roethlisberger and Aaron Rodgers met in the Super Bowl back in 2010. But yeah, the Steelers won this game 35-31. The Cowboys were mounting a bit of a comeback at the end, but it was just too little too late. This game left an unfortunate mark on the career of Hall of Fame tight end Jackie Smith. Us sports fans have a way of remembering the lows in certain player careers. Like in baseball, Moises Alou had an amazing 17-year career, but he's best remembered for freaking out after the Steve Bartman play. And we all remember Bill Buckner for his devastating error in the 1986 World Series. And when you think about Mark Sanchez, chances are the butt fumble will come to mind way before him defeating Peyton Manning and Tom Brady in consecutive playoff games will. This phenomenon has affected Hall of Fame tight end Jackie Smith. He was at the very end of his career during this game. In fact, it was the last game he'd ever played in. In 1978, Tom Landry gave Smith a call, luring him out of retirement, and he was down, so the Cowboys signed him as a depth piece at tight end. He didn't play much in the regular season, but in the divisional game against the Falcons, he caught the game-tying touchdown in the 3rd quarter of their eventual overtime win. And in the Super Bowl, he had a chance to make another game-tying touchdown in the 3rd quarter. Jackie Smith was wide open in the end zone, but the ball failed to stick to his hands. This was on 3rd down, so the Cowboys had to settle for a field goal. Smith was signaled out by the media and is often blamed for this loss. Staubach was later quoted in the newspaper saying how Jackie Smith felt horrible for letting the team down, and Staubach even took some responsibility, saying, "My pass was partly to blame. I looped the ball too much." He also stated how one call in one play does not make a game. Very sweet of Staubach to defend his teammate. Jackie Smith played for over 15 seasons, making the Pro Bowl 5 times. Along with Mike Ditka, he was one of the first tight ends to showcase his pass-catching ability in a time where tight ends were more expected to block. He had a great career, but is unfortunately remembered for this dropped pass. I'm sorry, I'm getting off topic. This video is for the quarterbacks, the NFL's privileged class. So yeah, in the 70s, Terry Bradshaw and Roger Staubach met twice in the Super Bowl, and Bradshaw bested him each time. For the next example, we must take a look at the 1984 NFL season. In Miami, there was a quarterback taking the league by storm. He was putting up numbers you wouldn't believe, and he threw a very pretty ball. That quarterback is Dan Marino. That season, he was the first quarterback to throw for over 5,000 yards in a season, something that wouldn't happen again for another 24 years when Drew Brees accomplished it. We'll talk about Drew later. He also threw a ridiculous 48 touchdown passes. No quarterback before Dan Marino in 1984 even touched 40 pass touchdowns in a season, and Dan Marino had nearly 50. The previous leaders were George Blanda and Y.A. Tittle, who each threw 36. So yeah, the Dolphins' offense was unlike anything the NFL had ever seen before, and it was led by a 23-year-old quarterback who was just getting started. The league was terrified. The Dolphins coasted their way to Super Bowl 19, where they were to meet Joe Montana and the San Francisco 49ers. The Niners have been there before. Joe Montana won the Super Bowl in 1981, so he knew how to win. Joe Montana and Dan Marino are each undeniably top 10 quarterbacks of all time. Some may even have them both in the top 5. But the difference between them is Joe Cool's career was more defined by him being a winner, while Dan Marino's career is more defined by him being a statistical god, as he would retire with the most pass touchdowns and pass yards of all time, with a pretty sizable chunk ahead of the number 2 guys. He had nearly 10,000 more pass yards than John Elway, who was number 2 all time in pass yards. Man, Dan Marino was just so insanely ahead of his time statistically speaking. The 49ers finished the season at 15-1, and the Dolphins finished the season at 14-2. Both of these teams were incredible, so it seemed like we were in for a great matchup. The 49ers were favored by 3.5, as they were the more experienced team, which is funny because the Dolphins' last trip to the Super Bowl was actually more recent than the Niners' last trip, but that was in the fluky 1982 season, which was shortened to 9 games due to a player strike. So despite Dan Marino's absolutely historic statistical output this season, the 49ers were generally viewed as the better overall football team, and they were, as the big game would show. The first quarter of Super Bowl 19 went as expected. The Dolphins led 10-7, and Marino led 2 scoring drives with a Joe Montana touchdown pass sandwich in between. But the 49ers put up 21 points to end the first half, and due to a lack of scoring by the Dolphins offense in the second half, a lack of scoring meaning 0 points, the 49ers won by a score of 38-16. Joe Montana undoubtedly outplayed Dan Marino. He was named the game's MVP as he tossed 3 touchdowns, had over 300 yards, and posted a passer rating of 127.2, while Marino had his worst performance of the season by far. The Dolphins posted their lowest scoring output of the season, and Dan Marino was bad in this game. He had his lowest passer rating of the season with a dismal 66.9. He also threw 2 interceptions to just 1 touchdown. It was the only game where he threw more interceptions than touchdowns that season. This was one of the most humbling games of all time. The golden-armed youngster who faced very little adversity all season was absolutely humbled in the Super Bowl by a better team where nothing was coming easy to him. It was not the best week for him to have his worst performance of the season. Joe Montana would appear in 2 more Super Bowls after this one, winning both of them, while Dan Marino famously would never have another chance to play in the Super Bowl ever again. Despite this, he is still often considered one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time, definitely the best to never win a Super Bowl. In Joe Montana's final Super Bowl, Super Bowl 24 to be exact, he faced off against fellow legendary quarterback John Elway. Okay, there is no way to sugarcoat this game. Unless you were a 49ers fan, this is just about as least entertaining as a Super Bowl can be. The 49ers won 55-10, a 45-point loss for Elway and his Broncos, the most lopsided score in Super Bowl history. This was a common theme for John Elway in the mid to late 80s. From 1986 to 1989, John Elway appeared in 3 Super Bowls, and each time his Broncos got absolutely smacked, starting against the Giants in 1986 in a 39-20 loss. Elway was underwhelming. Relatively speaking, his performance in that Super Bowl wasn't that bad when compared to the other 2 Super Bowls he started in the 80s. He had over 300 pass yards and scored 2 total touchdowns, but in 1987, coming off an MVP season, which if you ask me, should have went to Jerry Rice, watch my video on it when you're done with this one, he folded in the big game against the Washington Redacteds. his Broncos got smacked, and he just flat out sucked, throwing 3 interceptions and posting a passer rating of 36.8, again, insert the Jaguar Gator 9 quote. And in 1989, in his matchup against Joe Cool in Super Bowl 24, I desperately wish there was an epic quarterback duel between these two amazing talents, but there isn't. John Elway had one of the worst starts a quarterback has ever had in the Super Bowl. Worse than Tony Eason, who was traumatized by Richard Dent in the '85 Bears. Worse than Rich Gannon in 2002, who couldn't quite put the cherry on top of his amazing late career renaissance with a Super Bowl win. And definitely worse than Cam Newton in Super Bowl 50. Well, at least he wasn't as bad as Kerry Collins was against that amazing Ravens defense. But yeah, in his 3 trips to the Super Bowl, Elway sucked. Those 3 games combined, he barely completed 45% of his passes. He had a passer rating of 49.5 and threw just 2 touchdowns to 6 interceptions. He also ran a couple in, but it didn't really matter much though. Despite these awful performances, he at least had 3 great career-defining games in the AFC title games leading up to these disappointing Super Bowls, all of which were against the Cleveland Browns. The first one, John Elway had the quintessential clutch performance in NFL lore with a legendary 98-yard drive to tie the game up with 37 seconds left in regulation in their eventual overtime win. That drive is literally called The Drive. That's how you know it was legendary. In the following year, he kicked ass again, but that game is best remembered for this fumble. And to complete that hat trick of contributing to the Cleveland sports curse, again he ripped out the hearts of Browns fans by slicing them up en route to the Super Bowl yet again. It would appear that Elway was just not meant to win the Super Bowl, much like Dan Marino. For the next several seasons, John Elway would build his case as an all-time great quarterback, and he finally got a chance to play in the big game again in 1997 against Brett Favre in the Green Bay Packers in Super Bowl 32. Brett Favre was incredible. In 1997, he was awarded his 3rd consecutive MVP and had one of the finest 3-year stretches of quarterbacking of all time. He won the Super Bowl in the previous year and was committed to repeating. It was the young buck 28-year-old Brett Favre against the old head 37-year-old John Elway, the 2 best quarterbacks of the 90s facing off in the Super Bowl, and it was awesome. Green Bay was favored by 11, and that seemed likely when Brett Favre took only 8 plays to find Antonio Freeman in the end zone for the game's first points. John Elway didn't play all too well in this game, but the Broncos had one of the most talented running backs of all time in his prime in Terrell Davis. He fought through migraines in this game and ran for 157 yards and 3 touchdowns, a Super Bowl record, and an MVP performance. Despite this, the most iconic rushing play in this game was actually from John Elway. In a tie game, late in the 3rd quarter on 3rd and 6, John Elway took off in an attempt to move the sticks. He dived at the marker and his body spun around like a helicopter, hence why this play has been named the helicopter dive. It was an amazing effort to extend the drive, which later resulted in a Terrell Davis touchdown. The game was tied at 24 late in the 4th quarter, and Elway did what he did best. The Broncos had the ball at midfield, and Elway led the game-winning drive. Terrell Davis did most of the work on that drive though, but Elway's only pass attempt of that drive was a 23-yard completion to Howard Griffith to set up Terrell Davis, who punched it in 2 plays later. John Elway finally did it. He was a Super Bowl champion. Brett Favre definitely outplayed him though, but who cares? The goal is to win, and Elway did just that. A year later in Super Bowl 33, Elway and the Broncos would return to the Super Bowl, where he would finally have his quality performance in the big game, winning the MVP and retiring from the NFL, ending his career with consecutive Super Bowl wins, putting an end to a fabled career as one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time. Can you really talk about the greatest quarterbacks of all time without mentioning Peyton Manning? Of course you can't. How about Drew Brees? Drew was also awesome, and in 2009, both of these men were at the top of their games. If you watched football in 2009, it became quite clear by Thanksgiving that the likely Super Bowl matchup was going to be Peyton's Colts and Drew's Saints. And it was, because when Super Bowl 44 came around, that was the exact matchup. Peyton Manning won the regular season MVP in 2009, but I feel like that award belonged to Drew Brees. It didn't really matter much though, because at this point it was all about who won this football game. When the game started, it looked like Peyton had the edge on Brees as his Colts took an early 10-0 lead, but by the end of the first half, the Saints got 2 field goals to make it a 10-6 game going into halftime. The Saints were to kick off to the Colts to start the second half, but then one of my favorite plays of all time took place.
Every time he comes off the field. Onside kick to start the second half, and the ball bounces off the hands of the Colt at the Saints.
Surprise onside kick to start the second half of the Super Bowl. Awesome. The Saints capitalized on recovering that onside kick with a Pierre Thomas 16-yard touchdown grab, but Peyton Manning immediately replied, leading a touchdown drive of his own. Fast forwards to late in the fourth quarter. The Saints lead 24-17, but Peyton Manning was on his way to leading a clutch drive to tie this game up. At the Saints' 31-yard line, on 3rd and 5, Peyton Manning tries to hit Reggie Wayne, but Tracy Porter picks it off and takes it 74 yards to the end zone to put the Saints up by 2 scores and putting the dagger in this game. Drew Brees won the MVP and added a Super Bowl championship to his already impressive resume. So yeah, for my estimation, those were the results of all-time great quarterbacks meeting in the Super Bowl. I could talk about Super Bowl 55 when Brady Mahomes met, but I really don't feel like talking about it. We all know what happened there. Some honorable mentions include Bart Starr and Len Dawson in Super Bowl 1, Roger Staubach and Bob Greasy in Super Bowl 6, Fran Tarkenton and Bob Greasy in Super Bowl 8, Troy Aikman and Jim Kelly when they met twice in the 90s, Kurt Warner and Tom Brady in Super Bowl 36, Kurt Warner and Ben Roethlisberger in Super Bowl 43, and Big Ben and Aaron Rodgers in Super Bowl 45. Oh, and to answer the question from the beginning of this video, the quarterback who took the Chargers to the Super Bowl in 1994 was Stan Humphries. Good night, everyone.